Your girl is on fire. Saturn has entered Aries and I am feeling it. Someone please call 911. I am literally on fire. I cannot stop. Or, if you're in the UK, call 999. It's a good time, especially with Prince Andrew. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Prince Andrew. We're going to talk about Epstein. We're going to talk about Trump. We're going to talk about all these cycles that are connecting themes, events, and how all of these cycles are coming into play in 2026, and how you can take your own theories and your own predictions and track them with these cycles. See what comes up. See what you remember from certain time points in this. Now, with that being said, it's not conclusive. So I don't want to see in the comment section your theories, what you agree with, what you don't agree with. That's not the type of podcast this is. I am presenting to you astrological data and events that happened at those time points or around those time points. And you can take it or leave it. But if you are interested in this type of podcast episode and you want me to investigate certain things, certain cycles, events that are tied to them, please feel free to put that in the comments. If you want me to track certain things from the past, how they might be playing out in the future, drop that down. I am investigating the Guthrie case, obviously, at this time, especially since it happened with the Mars-Pluto conjunction, which seems to be a thing in big cases. Anyways, that's still on the table. I am still investigating that. If you want me to do something on that, let me know. But again, let's get into it. This might be the podcast episode that gets me flagged or canceled or demonetized. So if you don't hear from me and you don't see any post after this, then bye. I don't know. I don't know what to say. So yeah, we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the Neptune-Pluto's cycle. Neptune-Pluto sextile opening that we're in the last phase of. So Neptune and Pluto sextile for quite some time. They kind of dance a little bit back and forth over about 100-year period, but they come really, really close, either like a 0 to 1 degree orb around 3 times, like 3 separate chapters or phases. So yes, I am aware that Neptune and Pluto sextile each other for a long time, and that may not be significant, but if you look at the degrees in the orbs, you actually see that it's sort of triphasic. They come really, really close to a sextile in certain points of time, and then they kind of take a break, and then they come back together again for another time. And then they take a break and they come back again to sextile. Well, we're in that last very close sextile that will pretty much be exact this year. And so we're in that last phase, which I think is significant before Neptune starts to move away from any sextile. I'm also going to cover the Uranus-Pluto trine happening this year, the cycles and themes with that. And I'm definitely going to cover some of the themes that we see in the news right now, how it's connected to their conjunction, opening square. But I'm also going to cover Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and your boy, Randy Andy, Prince Andrew, and overlap them because they have very strong Uranus Pluto connections in their chart with the nodes. So I'm also going to cover the Uranus-Neptune sextile that is opening and sort of playing out, and how all of these cycles are, this is the year where all of these cycles actually amplify and play a part. So I think that's why 2026, even into 2027, is really, really important, because we very rarely, if ever, have seen all of these cycles happen or start to kind of click into place all at once. So a lot of the astrology we've never seen before. So we'll cover that. I'm going to cover a little bit of the pharmaceutical industry. I'm going to cover a little bit of war, because there's a lot of crap going around World War III, blah, blah, blah. So I'll cover that a little bit. I have a different approach on it that you might find interesting. What else? So yeah, we're covering all the taboo topics right now, and I'm feeling it. I'm getting that sacral gut reaction, and I'm going with it. And it is what it is. What happens is what happens. What else? What else do I need to mention? Oh, I'm going to cover a little bit of like the cultural stuff too, that I think is going to come up, that we're already kind of seeing now that Saturn's in Aries. But I think some interesting cultural perspectives on like the feminine versus the masculine, what has happened throughout history with Saturn in Aries, certain configurations of that. So I think this is where things might really shift and change. But anyways, let's get into it. So starting off with the Saturn-Pluto cycle. Does anyone recall what happened around here? I don't know, just a pandemic. Yeah, so January 2020, around the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that seeded the event, where this year we're going to see the opening sextile, which can be theoretically opportunistic, or the ability to, the opportunity to maybe restructure or stabilize what catastrophe we went through. But again, I have some interesting, information regarding that. But again, the Saturn-Neptune, the new cycle started at a time we can all remember, at a time we will all remember the rest of our lives. But one thing I want to bring you back to is the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was the early 1980s. And if you're old enough, you will also vividly remember that time, because that was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. It was also a time of recession, a time of, economic struggle, desire to restructure. I know the housing market, at least in the US, was really, really tough as well. So again, it's not the same situation, but we see a similar theme of, illness. And in a way where we don't quite understand it at first. So there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of, structures crumbling because of that confusion or that chaos. Anyone can look up, the AIDS crisis and how much chaos and confusion and misunderstanding it caused globally. And yeah, so we had back in the early 1980s, you had the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. The opening sextile to the events that were seeded with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction had Saturn in rulership. I believe had Saturn in Capricorn. So this is where I want to point out the difference from last time. So if you're watching, I'm going to go back to early 1980s. We'll get it close enough. These are slow moving planets, so it's around this time. So 1982, 1981, 1982. Again, early 1980s. Then we get to the AIDS crisis, recession, yada, yada, yada. Then we get to the opening sextile time. From that seated point, this is probably around 1989, 1990. So I believe this was the time where we were gaining a lot more understanding of AIDS and trying to come out of, the situation, the economic situation in the 80s. But anyways, my point I want to make here is the opening sextile that is technically opportunistic. The last time it happened had Saturn in rulership. So that was a strong Saturn. This time, Saturn will be in fall by essential dignity. So I don't know how by essential dignity, like how durable that Saturn is going to be in terms of like the holding power, the sustainability versus, because the Saturn in Aries is kind of an irritable Saturn. So the impatience, the irritability to sustain and to hold compared to a Saturn in Capricorn, which is generally speaking pretty good at holding systems, at least ones that are being created. So again, there's different theories on this, but that's the main difference compared to last time, where I'm a little bit suspicious of, okay, first of all, we have Saturn and Pluto creating this opening sextile to what started back in 2020, where the opening sextile will start to go exact in March. Yes. So the opening sextile this time to what started in 2020 between Saturn and Pluto. Yes, it's a sextile. Obviously, I want to be optimistic about that perspective. But again, Saturn is in Aries, it's in fall. So Saturn is sort of navigating uncharted territory. Saturn is in foreign territory in terms of how to be a bit more like how to create these new systems and structures and among the other cycles and the other planets interacting with Saturn. So this opening sextile is different compared to what we've seen in the past. And Saturn and Pluto can be pretty ruthless planets. This can be the energy I get with the astrology is Saturn and Pluto can be sort of like ruthless, relentless, just tenacity. Yes, like this, like really powerful, the powerful desire to build, to do what it's aiming to do. But with Saturn by essential dignity in its place of fall, where it is navigating uncharted territory. And Saturn in Aries can be, again, it can be an irritated Saturn. Saturn can get quite irritated here. So like the ability to persevere, the ability to sustain that effort, I think can be tested with what we're trying to fix, what we're trying to rebuild, restructure, and maybe even stabilize through the Plutonian power and Saturn's sort of dedicated effort. So this opening sextile compared to ones in the past are, I don't know. This one's a little different. I think this one has the potential to amplify like the impatience or the irritability to change, to transform, to build, to start moving in sort of a more opportunistic way regarding what we've gone through since 2020. So moving on to the Neptune-Pluto sextile that will be exact July 24th, 2026. But again, I understand. I don't want to see in the comments how these two sextile each other for super long periods of time. I'm fully aware of that. Again, I'm looking at the exact or very close sextile, square, trine, conjunction, etc. So with the Pluto-Neptune sextile exact this year, this sextile traces back to the early 1890s. So again, this sextile, the seed event to this opening sextile happened back in the early 1890s. So before I get into that, I also want to point out that, like I said, this is like a century-ish long phase with these two sextile. So the seed event happened in the early 1890s, but the opening sextile has been kind of dancing or playing back and forth for roughly the past almost 100 years. So the first, and it's kind of broken down into three phases, like I mentioned in the intro. So the first sort of opportunity or opening sextile was around like the 1940s, 1950s. And this was really like the post-war situation, right? Then the second time these two got very, very close, if not exact, with this opening sextile was around like 1976 through 1980s. And I believe this was like the neoliberal situation going on, in addition to like economic recession, et cetera, et cetera. Now in 2026, we enter the very exact as well as very, very close opening sextile. So this opening sextile has been playing out, dancing back and forth for roughly the past 100 years. And we've entered sort of the last phase where they are exact, if not close, if not exact, to that final sextile phase. So I think this will be from roughly 2026 through about 2032. So I think that's significant. Again, this is my opinion. You can take it or leave it. But I think where we are in this sort of last really close sextile phase that's been playing out for almost 100 years between these two, that seeded or initiated back in the early 1890s, I think that's really significant. So let's go back. What happened around the early 1890s during the Neptune-Pluto conjunction that seeded this very super long cycle that's playing out? Well, we had in the US, we had the Immigration Act of 1891. So this was, I believe, actually the first centralized federal immigration control. So, yeah. I mean, we're seeing that now. We're seeing that play out now once again. So, interesting how that was the first centralized federal immigration control. And well, here we are. Here we are again. And this was in early 1890s. We also had the McKinley tariff. And this was really interesting because I'm just going to read it. The McKinley tariff of 1890 was a protectionist law that raised U.S. import duties to a record average of nearly 50%. And it was designed to protect domestic manufacturing from foreign competition, and it caused sharp price increases for consumers. I mean, if you're not laughing at this point, like the fact that, again, I'm looking at it from a US perspective because that's where I'm located. So you might be able to go back and, whatever country you're from and listening in, you might be able to go back and see similar cycles play out in your own country. But I mean, this is stand-up comedy to me. The repeating themes. Also, in the early 1890s, this was also like the collapse of the gold reserves. And that's really interesting because we're in a time where silver is increasing quite a bit. So we'll see what happens with silver and gold. That's like a whole nother situation. But I mean, this is stand-up comedy. This is hilarious. So the seed event to this opening sextile that has been playing out roughly for the past 100 years, but more specifically around the 1940s, 1950s, then again in mid-1970s through mid-1980s. And then here we are in the last phase, 2026 through roughly 2032. So you can kind of see how the seed event can have reoccurring themes at these opening sextiles, squares, oppositions, etc. So again, Neptune-Pluto cycle, I think this is where, potential economic situations, as well as federal power, immigration, especially since this was like the first centralized federal immigration control with the Immigration Act of 1891, the tariff situation that also happened back in 1890 with this conjunction that now we are seeing again in this opening sextile phase that is exact in 2026. So yeah. And just reiterating this sextile being very, very close, if not exact, starting in 2026 through roughly 2032 in this final phase before Neptune starts to really move on and completely get out of that sextile and start making way towards the square a long time from now. But I think from 2026 through 2032, we could really see those similar themes. We could see, we already have, right? We already have seen the immigration and the tariffs. And I think this is something that with the opening sextile, we're going to really try to kind of reckon with. And I think this could really play into other things with the Neptune and Aries, like the pharmaceutical industry, which I'm going to get to in another segment, which is really interesting. But I think that could potentially be tied to sort of these things that we're seeing with the seed event and the opening sextile, really roughly through 2032. Getting into the Uranus-Pluto trine, that we're already in We've already been feeling, a lot of us. It's exact around July 17th or July 18th, depending on where you are in the world. But again, these slow outer planets, we feel them over a longer period of time. And so we're already feeling this. I think it could potentially even intensify as we get into the summer, or I guess if you're in the southern hemisphere, winter, whatever, around July 2026, excuse me. Now, this one's, I think, going to be a little bit more juicy, a little bit more complicated, because the Uranus-Pluto seems to bring up Epstein stuff, as well as the Saturn-Neptune, which I'll talk about when I overlap the trifecta chart: Maxwell, Randy Andy, Epstein. So we'll get to that. But to sort of reiterate the immigration acts, the Uranus-Pluto trine, that will be exact, in July of 2026, the seed event of, so going back to when Uranus and Pluto were conjunct, they were joined. This was around 1965. So again, back around 1965, we saw the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, signed by Johnson. So this was it's just really fascinating how almost all the cycles I kept seeing Immigration Act, Immigration Act, Immigration Act, among other things. So what's interesting about this Immigration Act, though, back in 1965, at the seed event of this Uranus-Pluto conjunction that now we're at the opening trine to in the story, that Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that changed the demographic future of the US. That really shifted things because it basically changed the national origins quota system. So again, I could be wrong. I apologize if I am wrong because I'm doing this off the top of my head. But I believe this was when we used to, like, there was more immigrants from Europe prior to this. And this Immigration and Nationality Act sort of shifted things more towards sort of Latin America and Asia or China. So I believe this is where, again, I could be wrong. I'm assuming that this is when we saw more Asians, more Latin American sort of be able to come into, be able to immigrate more. So it kind of shifted. Because of that, you allow different demographics to come into your country. You're going to sort of shift the demographic population and sort of impacts with that. So I think it's really, really interesting that back when these two joined, again, we saw another Immigration Act, but it shifted the demographic. And we are seeing that again now. So again, it's like stand-up comedy to me. It truly is. So anyways, take it or leave it. But again, touching on a little bit of Russia, Ukraine, around 1965 was really, I guess it was like the peak Soviet era. And I guess the return to more rigid control. But then the next hard phase, so when Uranus squared Pluto, right? The square is the tension, the action, the change. That was in 2014 when Russia annexes Crimea. So yes, they did the full invasion in, I believe, 2022, but I believe it actually technically started back in 2014. So I think it's interesting how the opening square kind of it seemed to bring back like the opening square in 2014 with Russia invading and annexing Crimea. I guess, again, could be wrong, but it could be considered a move to reassert influence over former Soviet territory. So again, similar themes, but depending on the aspect, how they play out. That opening square creating conflict, creating tension, taking action to what was seeded back around 1965, where it was the peak Soviet era, and the return to more rigid control, where, yes, we're not in the Soviet era, but the opening square in 2014 was essentially Russia, I guess one could consider, the reassertion of like influence over territory. So kind of see the similar themes play out. Now we're at the opening trine. So I think in 2026, the trines kind of dissolve obstacles. So I think this one's interesting, especially in the summer with all the other opening sextile, right? In the summer, we still have, or going into June, July of 2026, around the May-June time, Saturn's opening sextile to Pluto. Then we have Uranus opening trine to Pluto in July 2026. I apologize if I keep saying summer, because I know some of you in the Southern Hemisphere, it's not summer for you. It's so annoying I do that. So I think we could see more themes play out. Again, I'm not a psychic. I'm not here to be a psychic. I'm looking at data. I'm looking at astrological points, what themes came up. So I definitely think that this could continue themes around rewriting the demographic future of the US, which we're already seeing. I think that trines get a great reputation. They can definitely help, flow things along, but it's for better or worse, right? Like things can unfold and happen in really easy ways, but sometimes it's not always a party, it's not always the best. So we'll see what happens specifically, but I definitely think that these themes could continue, and there could be even the potential for things to just naturally unfold, where there's less sort of restriction or friction around them, for better or worse. But again, I'm definitely thinking that the immigration, the demographic situation, the Russia-Ukraine situation could kind of come into play here. Because when you look at the charts of Putin, even Xi Jinping, Zelensky, and Trump, there's some interesting power plays this summer that I think could come up. Now, when I pull up the charts of people, I don't always have an accurate birth time. So I am not always going to consider the ascendant, the descendant, the moon, really the angles and the moon, because those change minute by minute. So I'm only looking at the planets, the nodes that would not move on their birthday, which is fact. So I'm going with what I can factually rely on and not assume here. I'm here for data. I'm not here for assumption. Okay, so if you're watching, you might have an aneurysm looking at the screen right now. Don't worry, I am going to break this down. So I have Trump in the inner ring, this ring right here. I have Putin on the next ring. I have Zelensky on the third ring. And then I have the transits on the outermost ring. So I want to draw your attention. Well, before I get into that, I don't have a reliable birth time for Putin or Zelensky. Trump has a little bit more of a reliable birth time. It says it's an excellent rating, but I don't know how much I trust that. So I've removed the angles, the moon in the situation, because those move so quickly. So again, I'm only looking at planets where I know that's the degree that they were at on the day that they were born. Now, in terms of houses, I'm going to not really include house themes because again, your ascendant, your birth time sets that first house, it sets the remaining of the house. So I'm only going to use what I can reliably rely on. So without focusing on houses, anything like that, I want to draw your attention to this outer ring right here. So when we get into April, we will have a pileup in Aries. Now, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky all have prominent placements in Libra, the opposition point to this transit. So, this could be a potential point of oppositional energy or, increased activity with this opposition. But going back to the Uranus-Pluto trine, the opening sextile with Saturn and Pluto, as well as the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that we're in right now, all are kind of, again, all of these separate points in the cycle are happening simultaneously in 2026, which I think is really incredible. So let's just get to July 18th, roughly around the exact Pluto-Uranus trine. So Pluto here, Uranus here. What I want to draw your attention to is how the Pluto-Jupiter opposition is going to overlap with Zelensky's Mars-Sun opposition. So Zelensky has a Mars-Sun opposition in his chart that this Jupiter-Pluto opposition is going to overlay with. Now again, is that between his 1st and 7th? I don't know, because we don't have reliable birth time. Either way, that is strong oppositional energy where the sextile to Uranus and Neptune's opening sextile to Pluto and those themes that I covered in those segments could be coming into play. So I wonder if this, again, this, like, I'm assuming here, this is in fact where things could sort of come to like a strong conversation, that oppositional energy. Where are we going with this? Where can we end this? It could come into play. Again, Saturn in Aries, transiting Saturn here in this outer ring, is going to oppose Trump's Chiron and Jupiter, which could be challenging. It's going to oppose Putin's natal Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his chart, which we have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction this year, which is significant and could indicate his presence being more significant. Epstein also has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his natal chart, and his prominence this year, which I'm going to get to. But that transiting Saturn will also be opposing Zelensky's natal Pluto. So these are really powerful oppositions with Saturn, as well as this Jupiter Pluto opposition lying across Zelensky's Mars Sun opposition. So this could heat things up a bit. So I think this could be the point, like as we get into the summer. I think there is like another deadline. I'm not entirely sure. There is like another deadline, either maybe like late spring, early summer. Like, is it May, June? I don't know. There's another deadline to sort of meet or like figure out the situation, essentially. Where, maybe it comes to a head. Maybe there is that oppositional energy of, oppositional energy can be some of the hardest to figure out, the hardest to balance. One of my concerns with this is that in July of 2026, we will be coming off of a Mars-Uranus conjunction, which has the reputation of sort of creating sudden conflict. So again, there could be this point of like sudden oppositional energy, sudden situation coming up that maybe forces the three of these to maybe sort of deal with it head on. I'm hoping with the sextiles and the trines in the background, there can be help, there can be effort to balance this out. So very, very interesting. But the other thing I want to point out between these three, Trump's Mars, Putin's Pluto, and Zelensky's Saturn overlap each other. That is Mars, war, conflict, Pluto, death and transformation, Saturn, restriction, isolation, all just in a Congo line right here, overlapped in their natal charts. So I find it really fascinating how the three of these individuals have been forced to literally deal with the themes of these planets and the conflicts these kind of endure, essentially. Now bringing Xi Jinping into the picture. So again, just to reiterate, I don't have the most accurate birth times. We don't know their true ascendant. We don't know their moon. So I am only looking at the planets where they would be at on their birthday, which is fact. I am not looking at house placements, house themes, anything along those lines, because I don't have accurate birth times. But when we stack Xi Jinping in the inner wheel, I now have Zelensky in this second wheel. I have Putin in the third wheel. And then I have Trump in the outermost wheel now. So what I want to point out is the Leo placements in all four of these individuals. Trump's Mars, Putin's Pluto, Zelensky's Saturn, and as well as Xi Jinping's Pluto. So this is a really powerful overlap. I mean, again, Pluto, we have power, transformation, Saturn, isolation, restriction, dedication, commitment, and Mars, conflict, desire, motivation, all stacking up with these four. So it's interesting how in some weird way these four have stepped into positions of power and found each other. So, there's also the stack up in Libra as well, which, the Chiron, the Saturn, the Pluto, and the Chiron situation. Another thing I want to point out too is Putin having a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his natal chart. Xi Jinping having a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his natal chart, fairly tight. and Putin also having a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And we are having the Saturn-Neptune conjunction this year. Saturn and Neptune, at least, not only having a conjunction, but having co-presence, being in the same sign for some time, I think could, with their natal signatures, sort of Xi Jinping and Putin's prominence come into play over the next year or two, with Saturn and Neptune being in Aries, at least Saturn being in Aries for the next 2.5 years or so. So perhaps that could indicate sort of their prominence, or something about their prominence coming into play in 2026, where, again, going back to the summer of 2026, we will have the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction across Xi Jinping's nodes. So if you're watching, I'm going to show it because this is kind of crazy. So let's get to July. So Xi Jinping is in the middle. Xi Jinping is in the inner wheel. Zelensky is in the middle wheel. And then the transits are in the outer wheel. So the Jupiter-Pluto opposition transit in July of 2026. This will be going across Xi Jinping's nodes, which North and South node, which is really, really interesting. Again, I do not know if they are Leo ascendants, so please do not assume it's first house of self versus seventh house of partnership. Just focus on the natal placements themselves. So the fact that this opposition is directly involving Xi Jinping's nodes is wild to me, especially because you'll have a Mars-Uranus conjunction earlier, I believe in June, around June of 2026, sextile his south node, Neptune sextile his north node. So again, there could be prominence or Xi Jinping in sort of really interesting, almost like with the nodes, like where he's coming from, where he's going, some sort of amplification or alignment to sort of his goals, power, Jupiter-Pluto oppositions, power plays could really come into gear here. So this will be interesting to see play out, but this is pretty significant in my opinion, especially with it not only overlapping Xi Jinping's nodes, but also, again, reiterating its overlap with Zelensky's Mars-Sun opposition. So this one should be interesting. All right, so bringing your attention back, because I really want, if you're watching, I really want everyone to focus on this pile-up situation in Leo. So if you're listening and not watching, this is Xi Jinping's Pluto, Zelensky's Saturn, Trump's Mars, and Putin's Pluto. So we have a Pluto, Mars, Saturn, Pluto, and technically a South Node situation with Putin's South Node Pluto involved. So all of this piled up in Leo in the last decan. So about the last 10 degrees of Leo. So really hold that in your mind's eye, okay? Because let's switch to, let's put Trump here. So hold up. And yeah. So it won't let me do 5 charts, but what I want you to remember is, I'm actually, you know what, I'm just gonna do this. Just gonna switch to one chart so you can see it so clearly because I think it's so important. So remember that last pileup between Xi Jinping, Zelensky, Putin, and Trump. The Mars, the Pluto, the Saturn, the South Node situation, super intense planets, all piled up with their natal placements. When we go to the transits in the fall of this year, we're going to have this little situation here. So about 25 degrees of Leo with the South Node, Mars and Jupiter. That's a lot. So the North and South Node, the transiting North and South Node with Mars and Jupiter will be on top of Pluto and Xi Jinping's natal Pluto, on top of Zelensky's natal Saturn, and on top of Trump's natal Mars. In addition to Putin's South Node being there. So Putin will be gearing up for a nodal return. And this Mars is entering shadow to go retrograde. So maybe things happen, maybe things intensify, maybe there's more to come this summer. Again, this is all hypothetical. But once we get to the fall, there's no denying, at least astrologically, that a major situation or event could sort of like, maybe there's a shift, maybe there's a change. Now, what's interesting about this time is I believe this is when the midterms are in the US. So I think, you know, that situation with Trump, but also just what is unfolding politically, what is unfolding with the war, what is unfolding with these power players, right? We're not talking about like, you know, personal planets or anything like that. We're talking about Pluto, Saturn, Mars, pile up between the 4 of these individuals overlapping in their natal chart. And then on top of that, a major South Node, Mars, and Jupiter. Jupiter expands whatever it touches. So I wouldn't be surprised. Again, I'm not psychic, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a shift in power, there was a total shift in what is going on. I'm hoping with the South Node that it's like a release point to this conflict. But again, I can't be certain about that. So again, I'm presenting you the data. You can take your theories and your knowledge and apply it to what you know with the dates, the cycles, and what you're seeing. But again, I want to point out that this Mars is entering shadow to go retrograde. So all 4 of these individuals will have this Mars retrograde playing into their natal Pluto, Saturn, or Mars situation. Now with Trump having the natal Mars involved, Trump will be going through a Mars return situation. So this is sort of like a new 2.5 year cycle of motivation, desire, and plan of action. So again, interesting. Midterms are around that time. What's going to happen with the core motivations, desires, and plan of actions that could involve, you know, the Russia-Ukraine war, these major power players where, man, this is just really, really intense astrology for all 4 of them to line up almost perfectly. All right, so getting into Epstein, Maxwell, and the Prince Andrew, the not so holy trinity, I guess. All right. So once again, no accurate birth times for Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell. We do have a more accurate birth time for Prince Andrew, but again, I don't know how absolutely accurate that is. So I am just going to go based off of the more prominent, where the planets were on the day that they were born, which is the more factual point. So I got rid of some of the other personal planets, obviously the angles, the moon, just to kind of keep it a little cleaner to look at if you are watching. What I want to point out is the inner wheel is Epstein. The second wheel is Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell. And the third wheel is Prince Andrew. So, right off the bat, we have, again, another stack up in Leo, where Epstein's Pluto, Ghislaine Maxwell's North Node, and Prince Andrew's natal Uranus all are conjunct through the synastry. They all line up. So I want to kind of actually go back to where it started. I mean, here's the thing. What these people say, we don't know how true it actually is. So, according to Prince Andrew, Mr. Randy Andy, he claimed to have met Epstein in 1999. So if you're watching down here, I have the transit date in 1999. So in 1999, what I want to point out is the North Node in 1999 did go over this Uranus North Node Pluto connection they have in their natal charts. Now, it's interesting how Epstein has Pluto, death, power, transformation. Ghislaine Maxwell has the North Node, the amplification of, and Prince Andrew has the Uranus in this synastry, the destabilization, the change, among many things. But Uranus and Pluto can have, again, going back to the Uranus-Pluto trine this year, which is why when I overlapped their charts, it was so fascinating to see Pluto and Uranus connections in their relationship. But anyways, going back to this really powerful conjunction synastry situation where Andrew claimed to have met Epstein in 1999. Again, I have this down here if you're watching. And the North Node, again, adding more amplification, more attention to this stack up that sort of binds them together in some weird way. However, I think it was the BBC interview that Prince Andrew did, or I don't know, something. There was some interview where it apparently contradicts earlier statements made by his secretary, where his secretary mentioned many years ago that they actually met in early 1990s. So even if you go back to early 1990, there is still a south node, a nodal transit going over or interacting with their natal Pluto North Node Uranus that's bound together. So again, this is interesting. So even in 1990, you also have a Saturn Neptune with Ghislaine. And the Saturn Neptune over Ghislaine's Saturn, eventually over, So even in 1990, let me get my words straight here. Even in 1990, transiting Neptune went over Andrew's natal Neptune, and eventually over Ghislaine's natal Saturn. So, sorry, Mercury is in Pisces and I am like a blabbering mess right now. Let me rewind here. Transiting Neptune conjunct Prince Andrew's Saturn, eventually conjunct Ghislaine's natal Saturn, where Epstein has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So whether it was in the early 90s or 1999, there is still strong nodal connections that I wanted to point out. So like, whether it's true or not, there are still very strong connections that still tie them to this really, really strong connection here. So anyways, moving forward to the next point, I want to get to, let's see, I have the next point for June 2008. So June 2008 was the next major time, because that is actually when Epstein pleads guilty in Florida, and he actually serves jail time. So he pleads guilty, serves jail time for the first time for, prostitution, I guess with a minor or something like that. His typical thing with like minors and prostitution and sex trafficking. But what's interesting about June 2008, you'll notice, again, another South Node transit interacting with their natal Uranus, North Node, Pluto connection. Interesting. And there is also an additional Uranus South Node situation going on with Prince Andrew around that time. Now, why that's significant, again, lots of Pluto-Uranus, the Pluto-Uranus trine this year that we're already feeling, how he's already come back into the headlines, which I'll get to. But the Pluto-Uranus connections and then the Pluto-Uranus transits and cycles with the nodes become very prominent. It's kind of frightening. So anyways, June 2008, this is where things really start to amplify with Epstein, and you can kind of see the connection. Now, is Prince Andrew in the news at this time? Not necessarily. However, June 2008, where Epstein got put in jail, this whole thing, what's key about this time is that Prince Andrew continues to contact or be in contact with him, which comes back to haunt him. Especially, I believe it was the BBC interview really amplified that of like, well, he was convicted. It was publicly known he was doing like prostitution. He was, doing illegal activity. Like, as a royal, why were you still in contact with him around that time? So anyways, you can see the astrology if you're watching, which is crazy. The next time I want to jump to that was quite significant is December 2010. So, December 2010 was when Prince Andrew visited Epstein in New York after his release from jail. This is when a photo gets published, later, after December 10th. So he goes to visit Epstein. It becomes a thing. I believe he's photographed. People are like, why are you visiting him after he's released from jail? He claims that he went to end his friendship with him, blah, 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 blah. Well, after this, a photo gets published of Andrew and Virginia at Maxwell's home. And that's, which ultimately leads to Andrew resigning from his UK special trade envoy position. Now hold this key or this point in your mind, because his position from 2001 to 2011 as this UK special trade envoy person or whatever is important, because he just got arrested the day before his birthday and the day before the Saturn-Neptune conjunction went exact today when I'm recording this on February 20th, where apparently he shared, documents or information or something during his time on that position or in that position. So this is an important time. Again, down here, if you're watching, I have around December 2010 when he went to visit Epstein after he was released from jail, photographed the whole Andrew and Virginia photographed comes out after that. And even in December 2010, again, we still have a Uranus South Node transit with Prince Andrew. We also have, let me see what else. I think that's it. That's the next sort of key where Prince Andrew isn't fully in the news at this point. He is a little bit, but people are questioning. They're curious or they're suspicious. So we hold that point. The next day I want to jump to is December 2014. So once we get to December 2014, this is when Virginia first publicly alleged in December 2014 through her U.S. court filings that she was indeed trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein to Prince Andrew. Okay, so December 2014, this is when this comes out. And December 2014, we have another Uranus South Node transit that is trine the Pluto North Node Uranus pileup in Maxwell, Prince Andrew, and Epstein's natal chart. We also have Pluto headed towards Prince Andrew's natal Saturn. That's challenging. So yeah, it's getting, the trine and fire too. It's literally getting hot. It's hot as hell in this triangle. So that happens. Then we get to July, August of 2019. Another major point in this story. So July, August of 2019, this is when Epstein I believe he was arrested in New York, and then about a month later in August, he dies in jail. So the July-August time frame has this Saturn South Node and Pluto transit on top of Prince Andrew's natal Saturn. So, yes, there was obviously like the death of Epstein going on, but the fact that Prince Andrew's second Saturn return, the fact that Prince Andrew's second Saturn return was marked by the death of his friend and so much coming out about sex trafficking, the island, all of this stuff that really hasn't gone away, I think is significant. So it's kind of interesting how Saturn came along and did what Saturn does. It's like, yeah. So you can see the marks in this story where the second Saturn return for Prince Andrew was like, all right, this is Saturn's heavy hammer is coming down hard. This Pluto South Node was also gearing up to square Epstein's Saturn Neptune. So again, there's definitely connections here to the death of Epstein. But death transits and death transits and like sex trafficking connection transits are different in my opinion. So if I pull up Jupiter, let's see if Jupiter shows us anything with Epstein. So there was transiting Jupiter was trine the Pluto North Node and Uranus. So again, dissolving obstacles to expanding this weird, sick connection they have. So yeah, there's quite a bit going on here. Again, I could go into a complete rabbit hole with Epstein's chart, the day of his death, the configurations of it, the transits of it. It's absolutely crazy. But again, I want to stay on track here. So you can see like the intense, the July August period in 2019, you can see the absolute intensity of the second Saturn return in Prince Andrew's chart and the amplification of it, how Saturn came around a second time and said, the hammer came down basically, and it really hasn't stopped. So then we get to November 2019. This was the BBC interview that Andrew did. And in my opinion, again, everyone has their opinions. In my opinion, I don't think it went that well for him. Yeah. So shortly after that, that's when I believe he steps back from the public royal duties. So again, he is still in the second Saturn return period. He's also in a Jupiter return period where the Jupiter return for him is trine this connection here around that time, amplifying it, potentially amplifying their connections, their relationship, what they did. The Saturn return period really being a very challenging, heavy-hitting Saturn return for him, especially with Pluto involved. So then we get to February 2022. So February 2022, we see more connections. So February 2022, sorry if you're watching, I'm taking forever. So February 2022, there was an out-of-court settlement from Virginia's civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew. So what's interesting about this is you have a Neptune South Node connection with Prince Andrew's chart around this time. And transiting Saturn is also going over Ghislaine Maxwell's south node, which is opposing the Pluto north node Uranus connection that they have natally. So the Saturn return point for Prince Andrew was hard with everything I just mentioned. Then Saturn continued, and it continued to oppose their connection, their relationship, how they're bound together. Where the Neptune South Node could have been releasing something. So again, even though it was settled out of court, the configurations of this, the Saturn opposition to their connection, to me, makes it quite clear, like the Saturn wasn't done with them. The Saturn wasn't done. There's still more to transpire. In addition to, like, there's so many other connections I can make, but for time purposes, again, I'm gonna stay on track here. All right. Focus, focus, focus. So June 22nd is the next, we get to June 2022. So June 2022, again, we're gearing up for another Uranus North Node transit where they have Uranus North Node connection. So June 2022 was actually when Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So again, the transiting Uranus North Node with Ghislaine Maxwell and Prince Andrew's Uranus North Node connection in their natal chart, I think is quite significant. So it's sort of like, to me, the writing was on the wall in terms of, well, it's not over. And then in October 2025, Prince Andrew was officially stripped of any remaining royal titles. And lo and behold, Saturn was conjunct his natal south node. So again, the second Saturn return for him marked the death of Jeffrey Epstein, a lot amplifying, a lot coming out around that, his name being thrown in the mix of it, his connections to Ghislaine Maxwell, the BBC interview, having to kind of step back from public royal roles, etc., etc. Then the Saturn opposition to their natal Pluto North Node Uranus connection, where, yeah, he was able to make a settlement with Virginia, but that wasn't over. Then Saturn goes conjunct his south node around October 2025, and he's officially stripped of any and all remaining royal titles. So you can see sort of the Saturn's progression of, like, you doing your Saturn? Nope. Okay, next point. Doing your Saturn? Nope. And the hammer comes down every time. So once we get to the current situation, so let's just go to literally today. So as of today, on February 20th, he was arrested yesterday on February 19th at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, exact, where Jeffrey Epstein in his natal chart has the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So it's sort of like, it's interesting how he gets arrested and immediately gets thrown back into his connections with Epstein. And Epstein has that Saturn-Neptune conjunction where he's arrested literally almost exactly, I think almost to the minute at this point, with sharing information with Epstein apparently tied to his position in 2001 to 2011 as like the UK envoy, trade, whatever. So interesting how this happens. Now, the next thing I want to point out is once we get to maybe the fall of 2026, when the South Node starts approaching their Uranus North Node Pluto connection, Epstein's Pluto, Ghislaine Maxwell's North Node, and Prince Andrew's Uranus, their natal overlap, that transiting South Node and Jupiter, as well as Mars, which isn't being shown here, will start to go over that clump that binds them together. So looking ahead, this certainly is not over. Even though he was arrested sharing, documents or email, whatever, with Epstein, I'm almost curious if it is going to unearth more that will be amplified with Jupiter and heavily reviewed and revised with the Mars transit, as well as the Mars retrograde towards the end of 2026, beginning of 2027. The South Node, yes, can release things, but again, this South Node will be a reverse nodal return for Ghislaine Maxwell. So it wouldn't surprise me if she got questioned, if she got pulled into it. This will be very, very interesting to follow in terms of what this South Node is going to rehash with this, given the current circumstances of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, where once we get to the spring of 2027, that transiting Saturn is going to trine the Pluto North Node Uranus connection that they have. So it will be interesting to see what transpires, but how long it will transpire. I think there will be lulls. I think there will be times where it's not obviously in the headline. It's not, a thing. But I think there will be seasons where we see things unfold with these three, even though Epstein is dead, or some people claim he might not be. But again, that's not this podcast. You take what you see and you apply it to what you know, or what you think you know. So let me see. All right. So the other thing I want to point out, they're claiming that he was arrested for sharing information. Again, I could be wrong. I believe when he was in his role from 2001 to 2011 as like the UK trade envoy, whatever. Now, again, current transit, Saturn-Neptune conjunction, Saturn-Neptune connection, okay? It would be very interesting to see or potentially find out, if we ever find out, if I go back to 2005, 2006, 2007, where there was, 2005. So 2006, 2007-ish. So maybe a little bit in 2008. No. I would say 2006, 2007. If you're watching, look at this. Again, the outer whale is the transit. You have a Saturn-Neptune opposition overlapping with the Uranus North Node Pluto connection in the 3 of their natal chart, their synastry. So it would be interesting if something about this case or something that comes out is connected to what he shared or what was disclosed with Epstein that wasn't supposed to be disclosed with Epstein from Prince Andrew back in 2006, 2007. I would be really fascinated to see, because again, going back to the Saturn-Neptune cycle, he's arrested at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I wonder if at the Saturn-Neptune opposition that was directly involved with their synastry connection between this power play here, was the time that he shared the information or disclosed something with him, which was the time that was leading up to Epstein pleading guilty. Was it in 2008? So again, I think it would be interesting to find out if that information was shared with Epstein from Prince Andrew roughly around 2006 or 2007 at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, overlapping with their synastry. There was also a Uranus North Node situation going on as well, which Uranus tends to be connected with them. And if that also brings up or connects Ghislaine Maxwell with the Saturn-Neptune opposition, obviously involving her North Node. So something weird is going on here. Something very weird is going on. So again, we'll see what transpires. We don't know yet. We don't even know if we're going to know or gain any information about this. But again, I think this main connection here alone, the transits that you can see kind of connecting the dots, especially with the nodes, even in the transits or the connections to those natal points. And then the fact that he's arrested on a Saturn-Neptune conjunction makes me highly suspicious to Saturn-Neptune cycles and how the Saturn-Neptune opposition around 2006, 2007 directly overlays with their Pluto nodal Uranus business in the synastry. All right, getting back to the main planetary cycles. We are also going to have sort of this opening sextile between Neptune and Uranus. And this will be exact July 15th, 2026. So you can kind of see either the months leading up to July, August, or July in and of itself, really being this like epicenter of opening cycles for a lot of these players, because we're gonna have, Jupiter, Pluto, Uranus, Neptune all at 4 degrees in July. So again, Uranus, Neptune opening sextile. This is actually connected to 1993. So if you go back to around 1993, when Uranus and Neptune were conjunct around that time, that seed point, at least in the US, we had the Criminal Aliens Incarceration Act of 1993, as well as the Immigration Enforcement and Asylum Reform Act of 1993. So once again, we saw immigration being a thing. And so this could also add more statistical odds of amplifying those themes this year moving forward. But what's interesting about the immigration acts or Criminal Aliens Incarceration Act of 1993 at the seed point of this, and now we're in that opening sextile point. Those acts had a lot to do with proposing mandatory deportation of immigrants convicted of aggravated felonies. So once again, we see, that being a thing. It also introduced stricter, more like faster procedures for asylum claims. So in a way, like the potential to speed things up, which is another theme that we're seeing right now. And then, increasing border patrol, increased penalties for smuggling, visa fraud, etc. So a lot of the same themes that we're seeing with the other cycles play out in addition to other themes. But again, I think it's really fascinating that we are seeing the seed points of a lot of these cycles redesigning demographic, redesigning sort of like migration frameworks. Now, how this presents itself in your country, where you're from, what stories are playing out there, I don't know. Again, take it, see what happens. It's great, historical data. But again, policy, borders, movement of people, once again, comes up here. I want to move on to some more cultural, little bit lighter subjects. Not totally, because we're gonna cover some pharmaceutical stuff, but I want to talk a little bit about Saturn and Aries and sort of previously some of the trends, cultural trends that it has brought up, or sort of, themes that have come up with Saturn and Aries. So the last time that Saturn was in Aries was around 1997, 1998. And this is interesting because that's when Netflix was founded. Remember when you had to go to those like red boxes or whatever, like your grocery store, CVS, to rent a movie? And then it would be scratched and it would be the most miserable experience of your life. Anyways, that's when Netflix was founded. Google was also founded, and 6 Degrees, which was I think really the platform, or like the beginning of social media. So, which obviously led to like MySpace and then Facebook and blah, 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 blah. So we really saw sort of like new structural ways of connecting with technology, connecting with people. And with Aries being really what some would argue as like the birth of the zodiac, the beginning of the astrological year, sort of even the conception point, depending on how you're looking at it in Western astrology. Really like the birth of technology that allowed us to connect with people, allowed us to sort of interact with technology in very new ways, that has grown exponentially over the past 30 years. The other thing that was really interesting that I think some people might enjoy is Sex and the City. So Sex and the City, HBO, the ability to stream, or what was it, like Devo, like record your shows. But I think people forget how Sex and the City around 1997, 1998, I think it was 1998 when it first came out, it really changed a lot around women. It was a show where you saw the female friendship being the center of their universe and not the relationship with the man. The show, I think, also challenged and sort of even normalized conversations about sex, money, power plays in relationships, divorce, all of these taboo topics. And it also, I think, was the first, I don't want to say the first show, because I'm sure there were other shows or movies around the time that exemplified these things that I'm discussing about the show, but it's still you can still stream it on Netflix. It's such a staple. But it reframed single women as the new social norm. And so you saw, in a way, going back to Saturn and Aries, it's interesting how it came out with a Saturn and Aries and how it challenged the masculine. It challenged sort of the structures between the masculine and the feminine, and almost giving us a glimpse into what women think. And what's interesting about the show is the 4 women are 4 very different archetypes that most women embody all 4 to a certain extent. Maybe a little bit more of one, maybe a little less. Some people identify more with Samantha, being single and being free and, sexually free, all of these things. And then some maybe with Charlotte, wanting to be married, wanting to be a housewife, wanting to be a mother. So there's these 4 distinct archetypes. That's very interesting to me in the show, and how it exemplified the feelings, the thoughts, the conversations, the desires, the maybe, especially around that time. I think people now have a hard time thinking back to 1998, where now it's normal. But back then, in a lot of areas in the US, a lot of these things weren't totally normalized yet. But the show brought a lot of taboo subjects, not just about the different archetypes of women, or, the other side of women that we don't necessarily show, or how it's centralized around female friendship first, and then relationships and marriage second. But I think it also talked about abortion. It talked about contraceptive. It talked about pregnancy. It talked about miscarriage. These things that women struggle with in a way. I mean, not perfectly. Of course, it's HBO. It's a show. But I think it was a huge shift. It was a huge shift for a show like that to come out at that time, and really, I think, challenge and even make a lot of people uncomfortable in a good way around sort of how women feel, what women want, what do we struggle with, etc. So anyways, I love that show. And what's interesting is that the time before that, so the last time Saturn was in Aries was around 1997, 1998. The time before that was in the late 1960s. And once again, we saw a pretty big transition with the adult magazine era. So Playboy, etc., where women were going from a softer pinup era into more explicit sexual imagery for that time frame. Now, of course, we would look at that time frame and be like, that's probably like rated PG now, with what we find acceptable. But it was still, for that time frame, you saw a significant shift in how women wanted to be photographed, how women wanted to be seen, and how men's like the male gaze changed around that. So it's interesting how it's totally different from the 1998, 1997, but still is sort of a transition of like more authentic rawness around like feminine versus masculine, or like what we consider taboo versus what we want to show. And this was also, the late 1960s. This was also, I believe, around the time where contraceptives became more of a headlined thing due to their accessibility and people wanting more freedom around them. Because I think it was like, at first it was, you could only get them if you were married. But the late 1960s into the early 70s, that shift in what was acceptable and where people wanted to go and what people were fighting for, it really led to the early 1970s, where it paved the way for contraceptive to eventually extend to unmarried couples in the early 1970s. So I think there was also like more push for federal funding for family planning around the early 1970s. Again, I could be wrong for that, but this was definitely the shift around women's image in media changing pretty drastically, in my opinion. And sort of the push for more sexual freedom, more choice around contraceptive really coming into gear. So again, very different, but it's still a time where there's some sort of challenge or like aggression towards these themes with Saturn and Aries. Now, talking about contraceptives, right? Let's talk about the pharmaceutical company with Neptune and Aries. So, the last time Neptune was in Aries was in the 1860s. Now, what's interesting about the 1860s, the last time Neptune was in Aries, the major pharmaceutical companies that we still have today, Bayer, Pfizer, and Merck, all really came into play in the 1860s, which is really crazy. So, Bayer Pharmaceuticals was actually founded in 1860, I believe. And what's interesting about Neptune's reemergence or ingress back into Aries in 2026, Bayer actually recently got FDA approval for a menopause treatment for hot flashes. And Bayer seems to be a big player in the IUD implant industry, as well as like other additional hormonal products. So with the Neptune going to Aries, I wonder if women will challenge the taboo around menopause, around hormone replacement therapy. maybe new ways of challenging contraceptives. Like maybe they'll come out with a male contraceptive. How about that? So again, I think it'll be interesting to see like Saturn's influence and how it seems to change men and women, like relationships, how like perception in the media, connections to the media and technology, and Neptune's influence there now, maybe bringing in changes around the pharmaceutical companies. So what's also interesting, back in the 1860s, Pfizer doubled their revenue in 1868. So they were able to do this. It was really driven by war and antiseptic demands, like disinfectants and stuff like that. So a lot of people are talking about war with these transits. Maybe, like, I think there's always war. Will we see the same exact thing? I'm not sure. But what's particularly interesting about this is that Bayer was founded the last time Neptune was in Aries in 1860, or around 1860. And Bayer, I believe back in 2018, maybe 2018 or 2019, Bayer actually makes glyphosate, Roundup, basically. So Monsanto, I believe, originally made it, and then Bayer Pharmaceuticals took it over. I want to say in 2018, I could be wrong. Either way, what's interesting with Neptune's ingress back into Aries in 2026, since the 1860s, all of a sudden, Trump issued an executive order this week. Again, I'm recording on February 20th. So Trump issued an executive order this week, basically prioritizing the production of glyphosate, saying herbicides critical to national security because I guess like glyphosate and phosphorus are essential to like not only farmers but also military. And the fact that Bayer makes glyphosate, and I just think that again, it's like a stand-up comedy. The last time Saturn was in Aries, Bayer Pharmaceuticals was founded, and the next time Neptune enters Aries in 2026, Bayer Pharmaceuticals basically comes into gear with this executive order, which I believe, again, I could be wrong, I believe this also protects Bayer from lawsuits connected to glyphosate due to cancer or whatever. So I also think that there could be blurred lines with Neptune, and maybe its connections to drugs in the pharmaceutical companies, and in ways where like they're not held liable or there's protection for the pharmaceutical companies to sort of reemerge, which is interesting because the pharmaceutical companies, in my opinion, since 2020, a lot of people have changed their opinions on the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. And I think with Neptune into Aries, like there could be like alternative ways that they could like, I don't know, like my guess around hormone replacement therapy, menopause treatments, women like not putting up with painful methods of contraceptive, or, suffering through menopause, like maybe with women changing in the past with Saturn in Aries, that could be a thing where Neptune is also there, to kind of tie in potential pharmaceutical or drug themes. So I think the connection, like Bayer Pharmaceuticals starting in 1860s, and then as soon as Neptune goes into Aries again in 2026, they basically they make glyphosate, they get protected through this executive order, essentially. So it'll be interesting to see what the fallout is from that. Now, the other thing that is very, very interesting about the 1860s, with Neptune being in Aries the last time in 1860s, tariffs reached, I believe, around 47% by 1864. And this protected pharmaceutical companies from foreign competition. So again, with the other opening sextiles, trines that I mentioned, and the McKinley tariff, what was it, back in, was it 1861? Where tariffs are another hot subject this year, even last year. And Neptune's reemergence into Aries, and the last time it was in Aries, 1864, tariffs reaching 47%, and that protected the pharmaceutical companies from foreign competition. So I wonder if those themes will reemerge in a new way, or, I wonder if, sometimes I question, like, will there be new protections, new tariffs, new executive orders, new ways to either manufacture or protect these pharmaceutical companies from fallout or lawsuits down the line, on top of the protection they already have, by the way. And so this is really, really interesting. I think there's going to be some interesting things to see over the coming years with Neptune and Aries, and how Saturn, for at least the next couple years, plays a part in either holding those structures in place or restructuring them altogether. So the last thing I want to touch on, with Pfizer doubling its revenue back in 1868 with Neptune and Aries the last time, really being ultimately driven by like the war that was going on at that time. The war deaths, people dying, people needing treatment, people needing sanitation, antiseptic demands going to an all-time high. So that really doubled their revenue. Will Pfizer or pharmaceutical companies double their revenue from the same thing? Maybe, but I think it's really interesting that glyphosate plays a part in our nation's military, and the executive order was issued this week in February. So I don't know. That's another interesting connection. Will we go to war? I don't know. There's a lot of potential, but when you look, these cycles are independent cycles, but they're working synergistically in 2026 in ways that we've never seen before. So am I going to sit here and say World War III? Absolutely not. Like, that is not conclusive. That is not, we don't know. We've never seen this astrology before. So what I'm doing is I am separating all of the cycles and allowing you to combine them together and see what transpires based off of what you know. The antiseptic demands and the war deaths back in the 1860s that allowed Pfizer to double its revenue was due to iodine, which we still have today, and calomel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but apparently calomel was used as a laxative and syphilis treatment. So that's an interesting buy one, get one deal. You can detox and get rid of your syphilis at the same time. Anyways, my point is that there's writing on the wall in terms of military, as well as, I haven't even gotten to Iran. But there's some writing on the wall at this point. I think the transits in April, where we will see a lot in Aries, might be more telling as to where the energy is going to go, what's going to happen. But again, take what resonates, leave the rest. I'm realizing I'm ending this on laxatives and syphilis treatment with calomel back in the 1860s. So I'm trying to make a soft landing right now, and I don't know if I'm doing a good job of it. But basically, take what resonates, leave the rest. And also, if you're in another country, take these dates. If you're watching, look at the chart, look at the date. What was happening in your country? What was initiated, especially at the seed, the conjunction points of these cycles. And like I said, there's a lot of stuff out there about, Putin's going to die. He's going to get sick and die. We don't know his birth time. We don't know what that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, where it is going to officially land in his chart. So again, like I said, I didn't take house placements into factor here. So yeah, I don't really know a better way to end this, but 2026 is going to be a very, very interesting year.